Hi, my name is Karen Tucker, and I'm going to be doing an overview of World War II. Because it's such a vast subject, we can really only scratch the surface. But I will give you some of the main highlights. First, I'll be talking about the lead up to World War II, which is pretty complicated, but I'll try to sketch it out for you. And then I'll be talking about the main events. And then afterwards, we'll talk about the legacy, what came out of World War II, and certain key points about that. Okay, I just wanted to show you a very famous poster from that time. We can do it. This woman was given the label of Rosie the Riveter, which I will discuss a little bit more detail later on. Okay, let's start off with the lead up to World War II, which took place from 1939 to 1945. And try to remember that it took place in two parts of the world, so it truly was a global war. There was the European theater and the Pacific theater, which was in Asia. This kind of reaches back all the way to World War I, which took place from 1914 to 1918. So there was a lot of instability created, and it set the stage for World War II. It really left Europe in ruins, both physically and economically. It was a real disaster. What ended the war between Germany and the Allied powers was the Versailles Treaty. The Allied powers were the United States, Great Britain, France, and Italy. Germany was very resentful of the harsh terms of this treaty. And here's some of the things that it imposed on Germany. They lost their territories and colonies. They actually lost territory that belonged to the country and colonies overseas. They had to pay huge payments to victorious countries. These were called reparations. They had to take full responsibility or full blame for the war. And they lost a lot of their military power because they had to give up some of their major weapons. Another factor was the Great Depression of the 1930s. You might have heard of the Great Stock Crash of the 1929. That caused a lot of economic hardship, including high unemployment, pretty much worldwide. In the United States, we had very high unemployment, and also in Europe. And then something that we can relate to today, there was a terrible flu pandemic actually. It was called the Spanish flu. And there were a lot more deaths worldwide than there are today because we have better medicine and ways to diagnose it. So there were 50 million deaths worldwide. And then there was this led to or helped lead to the rise of fascism in Germany, Italy, Japan, and other countries. Fascism is a form of extreme dictatorship where the nation is more important than the individual. It's very racist, anti-Semitic. There are no democratic rights for the individual, no civil rights. And they also wanted to take over the world through military conquest, taking over countries. In Germany, the head of the country was Adolf Hitler. I'm sure you've heard of. He was called the Führer, which means leader in German. In Japan, the head of the country was Emperor Hirohito, and in Italy, the leader was Benito Mussolini, who was the prime minister. Okay, let's take a little bit of a look at Germany under the fascist dictator Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party, who was pretty much in power from 1933 to 1945. Even though Germany was already a pretty big country, he wanted more living space, which in German is called Lebensraum, through military conquest, taking over other countries and getting more territory. So he started invading and occupying smaller countries in Europe starting in the 1930s. Italy, an ally at that time, attacked Ethiopia and Africa, and at the same time, Japan invaded China in the 1930s. We can't go into detail on that, but it was a very brutal occupation in China. Hitler did manage to restore the economy and build up the military. So he was actually very popular. There were some resistors, but in general, he was very popular. The fascist Nazi party believed in enslaving and exterminating, literally killing what they considered inferior people, especially the Jews. He had a special hatred for the Jews, as well as people of color, gays, Slavs, and people with disabilities. Slavs meant the Slavic people, speaking people of Eastern Europe and Russia. Slavic languages are like Russian, Czech, Polish are some of the Slavic languages. His long-held obsession was to create or to continue a pure German race, which he called Aryan. This ideology led to the Holocaust, which was the murder of 6 million Jews, mainly in gas chambers, plus the killing of 5 million people of other persecuted groups, including people who were protesting, who were against his regime. If you've ever heard of the final solution, this referred to the extermination of all Jews in German-occupied Europe. He spelled out his ideas about this in his famous autobiography, or his famous statement of principles called Mein Kampf. Okay, here's some of this. So now we know some of the causes, and let's look at some of the major events. There's a lot of major events. I really just want to go over some of the highlights, some of the major key events that took place. Okay, the official start of the war really happened in September 1st, 1939. The war broke out when Germany invaded Poland from the west, and I'll show you a map so you get a better idea of where things were taking place. As a result, Great Britain and France declared war on Germany 2 days later. The Soviet Union, which is mostly present-day Russia, invaded Poland from the east, and so they divided control of the country with Germany, and Poland ceased to exist. It was not a country anymore. In 1940, Germany signed a cooperation pact with Italy and Japan, and these three allies became known as the Axis powers. So it was the Axis powers against the Allied powers. And remember, the Allied powers were at that time Great Britain, later Russia, and some smaller countries. Okay, World at War, major events, we're still continuing with that. From 1940 to 1941, Germany bombed Britain, it was called the Blitz, and invaded the Soviet Union, which was a vast country. It was poor, but they had a lot of weapons, and they had a huge army. The British Air Force actually won the Battle of Britain, and Germany at that point declared war on Soviet Union, even though they had an agreement, but Germany actually ended this agreement by invading Poland. So Germany declared war on the Soviet Union. Germany continued to invade and occupy European countries, including Belgium, the Netherlands, and France, and Italy decided to fight on the side of Germany. They were later joined by Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, which were Eastern European countries. The United States actually wanted to remain neutral. After World War I, the people in the United States wanted nothing to do with war. They did, however, send aid to its allies like Great Britain and France. When the war began turning against them, they were desperate for aid from the United States. However, even though there was this big isolationist movement, they were forced to enter the war when Japan bombed the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii on December 8th, 1941. You might have heard of this very famous battle at Pearl Harbor. It really wasn't a battle. They just destroyed a lot of ships because it was very unexpected. They didn't know what was happening. Right afterwards, the U.S. declared war on Japan, and the Axis powers, remember, Germany, Italy, and Japan, immediately declared war on the United States. The U.S. joined its allies on all fronts: Europe, Asia, Pacific Theater, North Africa, and the Middle East. Again, the Allied powers were U.S., Great Britain, Soviet Union, and France's government in exile because France was eventually attacked and taken over. France did not unfortunately fell very quickly. This was called Free France, which is based in London under General de Gaulle. And this attack unified public opinion in favor of entering the war. So the isolationists, actually, that movement just fell apart, and most people were in favor. The U.S. president of the time was Franklin Roosevelt, often called FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, called the attack on Pearl Harbor a day which will live in infamy. And this is one of the most famous quotes of the 20th century. Infamy refers to an evil act. Okay, let's take a quick look at the map. This was the European theater. This is a map of Europe. In dark purple are the Axis powers before World War II. and Germany, Italy, Libya in North Africa, and they occupied all the light purple or lavender countries. They occupied all these countries. And then Japan, which was in Asia, so we don't see that here. The Allied countries were Great Britain and the Soviet Union. And then these countries down here were all colonies of France and Great Britain. They're now all independent countries, but they were colonies at the time. The yellow ones are actually neutral countries. They did not take part in the war. Sweden, Spain, Portugal, Turkey, and Switzerland, and some others. So when you hear about D-Day, for example, you might have heard of D-Day, the mass, I'll talk a little bit about that later, but I just want to show you on the map when Canadians, US, and British forces had this massive invasion, which led to the end of the war into Normandy. That's right here on the northwestern tip of France. They came in right here in Belgium, and the Soviet Union invaded from the east, and the Americans and its allies invaded from the west into Germany. Okay, let's look at the home front. What was going on in the United States at the time? There were actually new job opportunities for women. Women did not have that. They worked. Many women worked. Many stayed at home, as homemakers. But there were new job opportunities because so many men were fighting the war that they were needed in factories to produce war material. The poster I showed you before, the woman with the bandana, was called Rosie the Riveter. This was a nickname for women factory workers who actually, after the war, were sent home so the men could fill the jobs. Even though many women wanted to work, the men were given preference. And many women actually needed to work to help support their families. Well, there were some very dark things that also happened in the United States. There were internment camps where Americans of Japanese descent, men, women, and children were rounded up and sent to these camps because the government was afraid about their loyalty. And many of these people were born in the United States or had been here for generations and considered themselves very loyal citizens of the United States. It was very devastating to them. They often lost their homes and businesses and had to completely start over when they returned. So it's a very dark period, and some later, but much, much, much later, received an apology and I believe some compensation. I'm not sure about that, but I know that they did receive an apology. There was also a public campaign launched to keep morale in military production. It was called Loose Lips, Sink Ships. They wanted people to avoid spreading rumors. They might have gotten some information from their sons and husbands and fathers fighting that things weren't going well, or they heard rumors and they really needed to keep up morale. So, and there was another concern. They actually were German spies in the country, but pretty early on they had rounded up German spies and imprisoned them. So it was really more about spreading rumors. And here's the poster that was, put up in a lot of different places. Loose lips might sink ships. There was actually rationing. You couldn't get everything you wanted, the amount that you wanted of food, because they wanted to send, the supplies for the war effort. So they limited how much families could buy. There were actually these ration books with stamps, and you had to give a certain number of stamps with each purchase. So for example, a pound of bacon was 30 cents plus 7 ration points. And you only had a certain number of ration points per family. Even though the United States had been in a recession during the 1930s, and there were all kinds of programs to put people back to work, what really brought people back to work was the war, because there was a massive production of material for the war, and this led to very low unemployment. Let's look at some of the turning points now, which finally led to victory over Germany, Italy, and Japan. Britain and in North Africa, there was war there as well. Britain and the U.S. defeated Italy and Germany by 1943. This was in North Africa only, then invaded Italy. The Mussolini government actually fell in July 1943, 2 years before the end of the war in Europe as a whole, and the new government joined the Allies, so they switched sides. Mussolini was executed by a partisan firing squad when he tried to flee to Switzerland, and he was actually hung up in public. There was so much anger against him. And a partisan is a member of an armed group that is fighting secretly against an occupying force. This is also called the resistance. There were very large resistant movements, especially in France and Poland. So there were resistance fighters throughout in many countries fighting against the Germans and Italians. The Soviets defeated, remember the Soviets were our allies at the time. They defeated the Germans during the bloody Battle of Stalingrad in the Soviet Union in 1943. The Germans stayed too long, and when they were retreating, they got bogged down in the very extreme Soviet winter, and they did not plan, and they lost a lot of people, a lot of soldiers. The Allies won the Battle of the Bulge as they advanced towards Germany. So the Soviets were coming from the east, the Allies from the west, and D-Day, as I mentioned, British, Canadian, American soldiers began a massive invasion of Europe in Normandy, France on June 6, 1944, lost tens of thousands of soldiers. You can still see the vast cemeteries for Allied soldiers on the beaches of Normandy. You can visit them today, like Omaha and Utah Beach. At the same time, the Soviets were advancing into Eastern Europe and finally Germany, and the Allies liberated France. A famous event in this World War II history is when the American troops walked into Paris, and Parisians were cheering them all along the route. Here's one of the pictures from that time. Here are Parisians cheering the arrival of the American troops and the Free French troops as well, with de Gaulle leading the way, General de Gaulle, who became their first president after the war. The Soviets invaded and occupied Germany. When they arrived in Berlin, Hitler had already died. He had committed suicide with his wife. They had married the day before, actually. In his underground bunker on April 30th, 1945, he refused to be captured by his enemies. Germany surrendered on May 7th, 1945, and this victory is still celebrated, mostly in Europe, a little bit here. On May 8th, it's called VE Day. And while the war ended there, it was still raging on in the Pacific. Here is a very famous picture from the day when victory was declared in Europe. A Navy soldier, grabbed a woman in the streets of New York and kissed her. It's taken by a famous photographer, Eisenstadt, I believe. And this picture is very famous. Okay, turning points in the Pacific, briefly. The U.S. won the battles of Midway and Guadalcanal in 42-43 and Iwo Jima in 45 after experiencing a series of defeats. And after victory in Europe and no end in sight in war with Japan, Harry Truman, the president at the time, approved the use of a new and very devastating weapon, an atomic bomb. Unfortunately, President Roosevelt died very shortly before the end of the war. He had just started his third term. Presidents were allowed to have 3 terms, more than 2 terms at the time. And this was a new and very terrible, terrible weapon. The U.S. destroyed the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki with atomic bombs, just absolutely destroyed the cities. But they felt it was the only way to get Japan to end the war. The estimated death toll was 200,000 to 225,000, either immediately or later from radiation sickness. This led Japan to formally surrender on September 2nd, 1945, which is called VJ Day, Victory over Japan Day. This is an iconic photo of the Battle of Iwo Jima, the victory at Iwo Jima. And iconic just means an image that makes you think of an event or location, often with emotional impact. Okay, and finally, let's look at the casualties and legacy. World War II is the deadliest conflict in history, an estimated 60 to 80 million dead, including 50 to 55 million civilians, and millions more were injured and or lost homes and property. Some of the legacy, what came out of this conflict, were that communism spread from the Soviet Union to Eastern Europe. Eastern European countries lost their independence and their democracy to Soviet Union for another 50 years. And it also helped lead to the communist takeover of China in 1945. China is still run by the Communist Party, even though it now has a capitalist system, a little different from ours, but it's mainly a capitalist system. But it is still run by it's not a democracy. And the Soviet Union is now Russia, and it's not communist, but it's not a democracy either. There was a global shift in power from Europe to two rival superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. And you might have heard of the Cold War. They became rivals. They went from being allies to rivals as they faced off during the Cold War, from 1945 to 1990, when the Soviet Union fell. And one interesting fact, which I didn't realize as I was researching this, is that was when the GED was created to help returning soldiers who had not completed high school, and also the creation of the GI Bill to help veterans pay for college and other expenses. Another legacy, it added additional impetus to the civil rights movement, or it spurred on the civil rights movement. One thing that was sad was that African Americans had fought so bravely for their country and suffered many casualties, and they returned home expecting greater opportunities, only to find the same discrimination as before. And some of the soldiers were treated horribly. And actually, it was not desegregated. They actually had their own units in World War II. President Harry Truman finally desegregated the military after World War II in 1948. And this was a very famous military unit called the Tuskegee Airmen. This was America's first African-American military pilots. They flew over 1,800 missions during World War II. There are just so many interesting topics about World War II. There are numerous books, movies, films. There's many subjects you can look at more online if you're interested. Just Google any, keywords, Tuskegee Airmen, Rosie the Riveter, Soviet Union, World War II, D-Day, that you can put into Google if you have more information. Or you can contact me if you'd like to learn more about it. I'd be happy to talk to you about it. But you can get so much more information about this. There's just a vast amount of information. So thank you. That's about it.